Hello and welcome to the podcast. On Monday this week, I turned on to BBC Two to watch a documentary about the Holocaust. It was a bit of a duty turn. I did not expect to watch it all the way through. I thought I knew all about the subject matter. Ever since I executive produced a 3-part ITV documentary series called The Longest Hatred 30 years ago, I've had an interest in seeing how durable is the appalling virus of anti-Semitism, and how every generation can be made aware of its disastrous consequences. In recent years, I've also been troubled by both the fact that Holocaust denial is still prevalent and that the Netanyahu government in Israel has a tendency to call criticism of Israel's actions in Gaza anti-Semitic in origin. The BBC Two documentary by Simon Schama is called The Road to Auschwitz, somewhere to which the 80-year-old Jewish historian had never previously been. I sat down to watch it, as I said, without great expectations, but I barely moved in the 60 minutes which followed. It was magnificent and should be essential viewing everywhere, and if you haven't watched it, please do. I wasn't surprised to see that it was made by Oxford Films, the multi-award-winning company which for 35 years has produced gold standard work. I wanted to know how the programme had been conceived, commissioned and executed, and whether it would be possible to make such programmes in the future, as survivors of the camps die off and television revenues for serious documentaries come under even greater strain. I was joined by the Chief Executive and Creative Director of Oxford Films, Nick Kent. Nick Kent, welcome to the podcast. That film that went out on Monday on BBC Two, and of course is still available on the BBC iPlayer, was an extremely difficult film to watch. When you pitch such a project, how do you argue your way through? How do you convince people and commissioners in the first place, that this is something they must watch?
Well, one of the questions that commissioning editors ask is, why now? And the answer to that is the 80th anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz and the concentration camps. So the BBC in particular, was already focused on that. And then the other question is, the Holocaust as a subject has been tackled by numerous very fine documentary films, not to mention books and dramas and movies. So if you only got 60 minutes, how do you use that to make an impact? And of course, the great advantage that we had in tackling that was working with Simon Schama as an authored journey of discovery.
I know you've worked with Simon on a very large number of projects, but the thing that astonished me about this was he's 80, just turned 80, and he had never been to Auschwitz. He's done programs, obviously, about Jews, about anti-Semitism and so on. Do you understand why he didn't want to go until this time? It's a quite extraordinary omission, some might think.
Well, you've really put your finger on the sort of touchstone for the whole film, because the fact that Simon, as a historian of the Jewish story, among other things, had never been to Auschwitz was really our starting point. And I know why he's never been to Auschwitz. He's talked about it. He was in Krakow years ago at the railway station and saw a sign saying, go to Auschwitz and be back in time for tea. And he felt that he was sort of put off by the idea of it being a packaged experience. I think there's another reason why he didn't go to Auschwitz, and that is that there is a temptation to see the Holocaust and Auschwitz as being synonymous with each other. And a big message of the film that we made is the Holocaust is not something particular to the Nazis or to the industrial killing of Jews and others, but the Holocaust was a continent-wide phenomenon. And that is the big message.
I think what was extraordinary to me, obviously I understand why he started in Lithuania, because his mother's family came from there. it was particularly appalling to see that the sort of mass murder carried out, if you like, by conventional methods in 1941 with the cooperation of the local community. It was equally dreadful to see how in Amsterdam, where Dutch did have the courage initially to stand up and oppose what the Nazis were doing, within 1 or 2 years were assisting in a process where 75% of Dutch Jews went to the concentration camps. And that conscious decision not to start with Auschwitz, but to start earlier, to tell us things we didn't know, but also to choose a place to which we could relate, Amsterdam. I mean, it's difficult sometimes with Auschwitz or the concentration camps to see them as anything other than fixed at a particular point in history. When you're there in Amsterdam, it could be today, couldn't it?
Absolutely. It could be today and it could be London. And the idea that the Holocaust could not have happened in Britain is dramatically demonstrated by the example of what happened in Amsterdam. Because, of course, the Netherlands was a sanctuary for Jews for hundreds of years prior to that. And if there was any country in Western Europe where the Jews felt safe, it was in the Netherlands. But they were not safe. And the way in which the bureaucracy of Amsterdam was harnessed in support of the Nazis' desire to wipe out the Jewish population, that creeping, what Simon calls the Holocaust with its gloves on, is in some ways one of the most shocking stories in the film. And it's something that, what's amazing about Amsterdam also, and the Netherlands generally, is they're in the process of digitizing the public records of Dutch people who collaborated with the Nazis. And they're going to be made public next year. And obviously it's very controversial. But the archivist that we interview in the film talks about how that sense of creeping progression, the dehumanization of people who you see as different from you, is something that leads to unspeakable acts.
I mean, it was very striking, wasn't it, when the wall came down and the two Germanys were united, and then the activities of the Stasi, the secret police in the East Germany, were began to be exposed. It showed that they were into every part, every tower block, every office block. That sense of infiltrating everywhere and knowing everything is something that it's very difficult for people safe in our island to understand, how that corrodes the society and makes opposition seem almost pointless. I mean, you lose the will to oppose because because they are everywhere, they are watching you everywhere.
Well, it's like as Mariam Tursky, who is the Holocaust survivor, who has the final word in the film, says, Auschwitz didn't drop from the sky. These things happen step by step. And, we're living at a time right now when what might strike us as being unthinkable yesterday is suddenly thinkable today and normalized tomorrow, is something we are experiencing day by day.
And the sense that in the past we perhaps assumed argument could start on the basis of agreed facts that were ascertainable. When you have societies now where the facts are denied, or there is this idea of alternative truths, then we've lost language, in a sense, or a common language, which is obviously fundamental. I mean, one of the things I was again struck by in the documentary was Simon Schama was obviously very uncomfortable. Not the natural discomfort you would feel about seeing these places, realizing what happens, but again being troubled by how you should represent them, what you should show, or the language you should use. He must be about the most articulate man you and I would probably ever met, but he was occasionally stuck for language that could remotely convey what was there in front of him.
I think that's true. I mean, no one has greater respect for the power of language than Simon. But the way that this film was made, these films aren't scripted in advance. What we start with is a kind of roadmap. And it was the director's vision for this film, Hugo McGregor, that it would be a series of, it would be experiential, that Simon would find himself in places and confronted with evidence and with testimony, and that he would then respond to that spontaneously in the moment. And there's a jeopardy to that kind of approach, but there's also an extraordinary authenticity to it. Simon's capacity to articulate how he feels spontaneously in the moment is what gives him this charisma on screen. And you talk about living in a post-truth society. I mean, nothing illustrates that more starkly than what's happened with the Holocaust. There was a belief that the memorials, the books, the films, the education about the Holocaust would inoculate the world against anti-Semitism. And that belief turns out not to be true. That actually we're living in a time of rising anti-Semitism and Holocaust denial. And so the obligation to tell that history and find new ways of telling that history is as strong now as it's ever been.
One of the other striking things about the documentary is that it was only possible to make it because, for example, people in the Warsaw Ghetto who knew that they were going to die wrote down everything that they could see or know about and buried it in milk churns and other things in the hope that subsequent generations would find them and the evidence would be there. And thank God it was, although what an act of, despair or trust or whatever, I don't know, to do that. And the other thing, of course, is the other thing which is crucial, particularly for a visual medium, are the photographs that were taken in extraordinarily dangerous circumstances that really make it impossible to question, or should make it important to question, the Holocaust. But again, with the use of those visual materials, there would be people who might say to you, you shouldn't show, for example, naked Jewish women at the point of death. And that awful question of, what is respect, what is not respect. You dealt with it largely by not dwelling too long, by not going into close-ups and so on. But that's a very difficult decision to make. When you watched the film, did you make changes because you thought it was too invasive? How did you deal with that problem?
Well, that's a very good question, Roger. I mean, I think that those photographs of the naked Jewish women that were taken, I think, by the Sonderkommando in Auschwitz, there's testimony that Simon reads out where one of the Sonderkommando, Gradowski, describes what happens to a human body when it's cremated. And he uses the phrase, "don't look away." And at one point, "Don't Look Away" was a possible working title for the film. And "Don't Look Away" is really the justification for using those images. I mean, the film that was shown immediately after ours on the BBC that night, the Sam Menzies film, also has very shocking imagery. And I think that "Don't Look Away" feels like the obligation that we all have to face the truth.
And don't close your ears, because what you referred to there, the description of what happens to a body, I'd never read or heard that before. It is truly shocking. Its images are planted in your mind, which you can't get rid of. And yet, it's absolutely right that should be done. Did you ever have any doubts about the explicitness of those descriptions of how a body burns?
I think that it's a similar kind of conversation that we had about the imagery. People risk their lives to take those images, and people risk their lives to write down those words. And I think that one has an obligation to represent those words and those images with as much honesty as you can. And somehow taming them or editing them just wouldn't be appropriate.
When you've got a film like this, obviously how you conclude it is always difficult, and it concludes with a survivor, sadly, who died about not long after the interview, in which he was quoting, I think, a poem which meant so much to him and dwelt on the need, despite everything, for compassion. Earlier in the programme, Simon had almost spit out the word pity. Don't give me your pity, in a quite tremendous moment. But in the end, the film ends up with compassion. And, of course, I don't want to make a trite observation about the Middle East situation at the moment, but compassion is so transparently absent there now. And once more, we're seeing on both sides a dehumanization of the other. It's this extraordinary idea. I mean, Jews, of course, have suffered more than anyone else, I think. But it's this thing about the other. We somehow need to define ourselves, to unite with our friends, to gather together by identifying and being at war with the other. And, of course, the Jews, for many reasons, have often been the other. It's a very strange human characteristic, isn't it? This need to identify, to fear, and to fight the other. I mean, is this just human nature? What is this?
Well, I think, one of the themes we really wants to explore in the film is the idea that we're all potentially culpable. We're all potentially, if anything, even if we are passive bystanders, we're all potentially culpable in condoning acts of evil. And that, some of the most shocking moments in the film was the testimony from Lithuanians interviewed years after the mass murder of their Jewish neighbours. And I'm sure you'll remember the archive of the woman who was interviewed about the gold teeth she bought from a Jewish man whose teeth were smashed out of his mouth while he was still alive and before he was killed. And she was asked, where is that tooth now? And she puts her finger to her lip and raises her lip, and you see the tooth.
And at no point does she seem to offer regret, apology. In fact, and maybe one's imagining this, there's a slight suggestion of a smile on her face. Yes, I mean, truly chilling.
And that is not something that's particular to 1942 or 1944. Human beings are capable of extraordinarily inhumane acts towards other human beings. I'm afraid that is something that will always be with us and something we always have to be on guard against. But what I think is, if there's hope in the film, the hope is through the risks, the compulsion of people who knew their lives were on the line to try and preserve a record of what actually happened. And, when we live in a post-truth society, to see the lengths to which people whose backs are against the wall quite literally will go to preserve a record of what was happening, especially in view of the fact that the Nazis were deliberately obliterating that record and trying to build amnesia into the whole project of the final solution, that is inspiring.
Now, one of the great unanswered questions, and of course couldn't be answered, it was one 1-hour programme, and what was raised by Simon Schama in the programme was, of course, what had happened over the centuries to have enabled people to treat their neighbours in this way. I suppose what he was hinting at, or what we want to explore, is this sort of conditioning by the church, amongst others, that had resulted in people being able to treat other human beings as subhuman. A long time ago, 30 years ago, slightly more than that, I did a series for Thames about the longest hatred, and we explored that, and I started off, coming from a Protestant background, thinking this is largely a Roman Catholic problem, until you come across the words of Martin Luther, and they are truly appalling. If you were now to try and propose to the BBC to make a series about the roots of anti-Semitism and the role of the church and Christianity, and looking at the role of Islam in terms of anti-Semitism, do you think you've had any chance of getting it made?
Well, I mean, we made a series called The Story of the Jews back in, I think, 2013. It very deliberately wasn't the story of anti-Semitism. And as Simon himself says at the beginning of the road to Auschwitz, he's always wanted to tell a story that celebrates the life of the Jews, rather than a story that leads inexorably towards the gas chambers. Simon says explicitly in the film what happened was only made possible by centuries of dehumanization of Jews, and the fact that the Germans were only doing what millions of other people wanted to happen.
Oh, indeed, what happened in this country. I mean, I grew up on the border with Scotland. Edward I was one of our great heroes, Hammer of the Scots. I was never taught that, of course, Edward I expelled Jews from this country, and they never returned. I remember there were one or two bishops went on and bended knee to the king, begging him to get rid of these people. Of course, they didn't return until Cromwell was Lord Protector and so on. But I mean, we're not that gaps in that history are there. The role of the churches, it seems to me, has not been fully acknowledged. The seeds of anti-Semitism and that fear and hatred of the other are still here. But you can also see, a lot of Islamophobia around, based largely on ignorance. And what you look to the public service broadcasters to do, or hope they do, is to look at this and say, in the end, there is a clear role for us to explore these things. And my impression over the past few years, as the BBC's income has been eroded by around, 38% in real terms since 2010, is that thematic, if you like, questions like that, it's much more difficult to get made, that you need particularly international co-producers, and this is a subject matter which so many of them wish nothing to do anything about, particularly in the light of the present conflict. So if you pitched it, who would listen?
Well, you mentioned that the BBC's revenues in the last 10 years or more have been cut by almost 40%. They're in an incredibly difficult position. And I think people like you and I can criticise the BBC for not doing as much arts programming or religious programming or science programming or history programming as it used to do. But the truth is that I think the onus is really on the government to really give the BBC the support it deserves to do what it can do as well as it can do it. I'm always struck when politicians attack the BBC, as they're wont to do, by the irony that the BBC and the House of Commons, they have quite a lot in common. They're both fallible institutions that are occasionally prone to mismanagement, sometimes outright scandal. But they're also institutions that, in each case, are kind of founded on a beautiful idea. And whether that idea is parliamentary democracy or public service broadcasting, the third thing they have in common is that that beautiful idea would have no purchase in the real world were it not for the flawed institution it's based on. It's a bit like, Churchill saying democracy, is a flawed idea, but it's better than all the alternatives that have been tried. And I think so much of the discussion about the BBC is about funding mechanisms or about, the amount of documentaries on the arts or religion that are on air at any one time. But the fundamental thing to appreciate is how profoundly important the BBC is, and the beautiful idea of public service broadcasting, to the way we live in this country, and indeed what we project beyond this country. And if you're a government that's talking about economic growth, and if you're a government that's concerned about fake news, then the answer to both those questions is to back the BBC. Because the BBC is really the engine that has turbocharged the British creative industries into being one of the most successful industries we have in this country. And the BBC is the bulwark against fake news. And you just cannot adequately do justice to how important it is, and how if it wasn't there, we would be profoundly diminished.
But it would take a real optimist to think that in the present financial difficulties, the BBC licence fee will, or whatever form of funding is eventually decided, will significantly increase. I mean, we've had this week the DCMS, the Backbench Committee covering the Department of Culture and Media, suggesting a fund of perhaps 100 million should be set up based on a sort of tax on the larger, Netflixes of this world, and somehow distributed to help the homemade programmes be made. But I mean, 100 million is compared to what the BBC's revenues total, about 5.5 billion, about 3.5 billion or something like that from the licence fee. It's very small. And you have other things going on, though, which are concerning. We had in a report from the IBT, I think just last week, showing that, when it's preoccupied with foreign coverage. And it says over half of all international factual programmes were travelogues. Travelogues are overwhelmingly presented by men. 35 countries experiencing humanitarian crises receive less than 7% of all coverage. North America receives significantly more coverage, and so on. And reports like this. And what all this indicates is that we are becoming less well informed about the world. And so if we just say to the BBC, here's some more money and carry on, is that sufficient? Don't we need a discussion about what we expect from public service broadcasting, what the priorities are, and if you like, set a broad strategy which the BBC is then tasked to deliver? Is it enough to simply say, give the BBC more money?
Well, I don't think it is. But I do think that and I think you're absolutely right, that the discussion should begin with first principles. What is the point of the BBC and what is the point of public service broadcasting? And I think there's a very robust argument to be made that the point of the BBC and the point of the public service broadcasting is absolutely fundamentally tied up with the health of liberal democracy in all its manifestations. And when you say you have to be an optimist to believe that the licence fee could be increased, if you can answer that fundamental question about the purpose of the BBC, and I've got no doubt that can be answered, then the case for increasing the licence fee, or whatever funding mechanism is agreed, is a strong one.
Finally, Nick, what about you? I mean, Oxford Films have been going for, 35 years now? You've won just about every award going. In fact, I have some difficulty in finding one you haven't won. Are you going to continue? Or, some people of, how shall I put it, your age and whatever, are retreating from the business. Are you?
No, I love what I do. I treat every film we make as it could be the last film we make, so we put everything into it. And the BBC... the people we talk about the BBC like it's a faceless bureaucracy, but of course the BBC is populated by individuals, and many of those individuals are passionately committed to the public service that the BBC provides. And, Charlotte Moore, who's just about to leave the BBC, but has been the chief content officer for quite a long time, she saw a clip from this documentary while it was still in the edit. And she sent me a note saying, I really feel for the director and the editor, watching this material day after day after day. And the fact that she expressed that kind of empathy and compassion and this is someone at the very top of the BBC, taking that kind of interest in the human cost of the creative process of making a documentary about the Holocaust. They're very, very good people at the BBC. And I think, we're living in a time when the BBC is in jeopardy. And what's at stake now is higher, I think, than it's ever been in terms of what the BBC can provide. If you think back to COVID and how the BBC came into its own at that time, we're living in a world where the stakes could not be higher. And what the BBC represents is profoundly precious. And, you ask, how do I keep going? I keep going because I'm enormously lucky to be working in an environment where the values of public service broadcasting, which the BBC absolutely is at the heart of, but overspill into all the other channels, Channel 4, Channel 5, ITV, Sky. Those values of public service broadcasting are resilient and they're vital. And as long as that's the case, and you have the opportunity to do good work, you want to keep going.
Well, I hope you do. And The Road to Auschwitz is still available on the BBC iPlayer. How long will it be available there, Nick? Will it in perpetuity?
You know what? I'm not sure, Roger, but I think for a long time to come anyway.
Well, I hope everybody listening managed to watch it. It is a remarkable film. Nick Kent, thank you very much.
Thank you, Roger.
My thanks to Nick Kent. That's the final episode in our 8th series. We're having a break next week for Easter, but the following week we'll be talking to Jonathan Dimbleby. We haven't monetised our podcast. There are no adverts to interrupt your listening. We're focused on keeping the debate alive around the importance of public service broadcasting and its future shape. Please do support our efforts for, less than a cup of coffee a month. You can do this either by one-off payment on our crowdfunding page or regularly by signing up to patreon.com/BeebWatch for £1.99 per month. By signing up to Patreon, this will also entitle you to my weekly blog, which gives my take on the week's interview. The link to this and our crowdfunding page can be found in the description of this programme. And as you probably know, this podcast is presented by me, Roger Bolton, and it's produced by Kate Dixon. The sound is by Dave Kitto, and special thanks to Quinn Genty. It's a Good Egg production. Have a very happy Easter. Goodbye.